The rope was fraying. Doss could see the individual hemp fibers splitting apart under the weight of the stretcher, each strand pulling taut and then snapping with a faint pop that somehow cut through the roar of distant artillery. His hands burned from the friction as he braced himself against the muddy edge of the cliff, boots slipping on ground churned to soup by 3 days of rain and shelling. Below, 2 privates struggled to guide the stretcher carrying Corporal Mitchell down the sheer face of Hacksaw Ridge, the wounded man's muffled groans barely audible over the wind that whipped smoke and ash across the escarpment. 40 feet of rope. 40 feet between life and a field hospital, or death on this godforsaken cliff. It was nearly sunset on May 5, 1945, and the ridge was supposed to be secured hours ago. Instead, the Japanese counterattack had shattered the American advance, turning what should have been a strategic foothold into a killing ground of cratered earth and shattered trees. The 77th Infantry Division had paid for every yard of that plateau in blood, and now they were giving it back. Doss had watched the retreat from his position near the aid station, watched healthy men scramble down the cargo nets and rope lines in panicked clusters, watched officers screaming orders that nobody could hear over the machine gun fire raking the plateau above. And then he'd heard what everyone else was trying not to hear, the voices, dozens of them. Wounded men crying out from the smoke, trapped in foxholes and behind demolished bunkers, bleeding into the mud, while the enemy regrouped in the caves and fortified positions that honeycombed the ridge. Each cry for help was a knife in his chest, twisting deeper with every passing second. Captain Glover had been explicit, his face streaked with mud and exhaustion when he'd grabbed Doss's shoulder an hour ago. "Doss, we're pulling back. The ridge is untenable. Get down the escarpment now." But Doss had stood there, hands shaking, staring up at the plateau where the cries continued. He'd joined the 77th Infantry Division as a medic, precisely because he could serve without carrying a weapon, his Seventh-day Adventist faith forbidding him from taking life. Back in training at Fort Jackson, the other men had mocked him for it, called him a coward, questioned whether he'd be worth anything when bullets started flying. Some had tried to get him kicked out, said a medic who wouldn't defend himself was a liability. He'd proven them wrong in Guam, crawling through machine gun fire to drag wounded Marines to safety. He'd proven them again in Leyte, spending 72 hours straight treating casualties during the push inland. But this was different. This wasn't about proving anything. This was about the most fundamental promise he'd made when he accepted the medic's armband: no man left behind. So he'd gone back up. The first man he'd found was Private Hernandez, half buried in collapsed trench wall, both legs mangled by a mortar blast that had detonated close enough to shower him with shrapnel and burning earth. Doss had dug him out with his bare hands, fingernails splitting against rocks and debris, dragged him 30 yards through open ground while machine gun tracers lit up the smoke like angry fireflies. The cargo nets were destroyed. The main trails down the escarpment were under direct fire. He'd stared at that cliff edge, at the sheer 40-foot drop, and known there was only one way: the rope. It had been hanging there since the morning assault, secured to a blasted tree stump by some engineer he'd never meet. Doss had rigged a makeshift harness from stretcher straps in his own belt, tied Hernandez to the litter with hands that barely remembered how knots worked, and lowered him down inch by terrifying inch. "Please, Lord," he'd whispered into the smoke and thunder, "help me get one more, just one more." That prayer had been 6 men ago. Now, with Mitchell safely reaching the bottom, Doss hauled the rope back up, shoulders screaming in protest. The stretcher came up empty, spinning slowly, splattered with blood that wasn't quite dry. His medical bag hung nearly depleted from his shoulder, 3 morphine syrettes left, a handful of bandages, 1 tourniquet. His canteen had been empty since mid-afternoon. His hands were raw hamburger, uniform soaked through with a mixture of rain, sweat, and other men's blood. Every muscle trembled with exhaustion, but up on the plateau someone was still calling for help. The voice was hoarse, breaking with pain and terror. "Medic! God! Somebody!" Doss closed his eyes, drew a shuddering breath that rattled in his chest, and started climbing. The rope bit into his abraded palms as he hauled himself over the cliff edge, emerging into a hellscape of smoke and falling darkness. Artillery flashes lit the clouds from below, creating a stuttering twilight that made every shadow a potential enemy. The Japanese knew the Americans had retreated. They were moving through the plateau now, finishing off the wounded, reclaiming their positions. Doss could hear their voices in the distance, sharp syllables cutting through the rumble of distant bombardment. He found the source of the crying in a collapsed dugout 30 yards from the cliff edge. Sergeant Howell lay in a muddy depression, chest torn open by shrapnel, blood pooling beneath him in the crater. The sergeant's eyes were wide with shock and fading hope when they focused on Doss's face. "Doss?" His voice was barely a whisper. "You came back." Doss dropped to his knees, hands already moving, assessing the wounds by touch in the poor light. Sucking chest wound, possible punctured lung, severe hemorrhaging, critical, maybe minutes left without treatment. He tore open his last proper field dressing, packing the wound as best he could, with supplies meant for minor injuries. It wouldn't hold long. Nothing would hold long up here. "I'm here, Sergeant. Stay with me." His voice was steadier than his hands. Howell had been one of the men who'd called him a coward in basic training, who'd questioned whether he deserved to wear the uniform, who'd laughed when Doss refused to touch a rifle during weapons training. None of that mattered now. All that mattered was getting him to that rope. The stretcher was back at the cliff edge, 200 yards away across open ground. Doss got his arms under Howell's shoulders and started dragging. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The sergeant was a big man, easily 190, and dead weight with shock. Every few feet Doss had to stop, catch his breath, pray for strength. His boots slipped in the mud. His hands kept losing their grip on Howell's uniform. The distance to the cliff edge seemed to grow with each step rather than shrink. Machine gun fire erupted somewhere to his left, stitching the ground with impacts that threw up fountains of mud and pulverized earth. Doss flattened, sheltering Howell's body with his own, feeling the concussive whump of rounds passing overhead, close enough to make his ears ring. Fragments of rock and shrapnel pinged off his helmet. When it stopped, he kept dragging. Halfway to the cliff edge, his strength gave out completely. He simply couldn't pull anymore. His arms were numb. His legs wouldn't respond to his brain's desperate commands. He knelt there in the mud, gasping, tears streaming down his face, cutting tracks through the grime, and did the only thing he knew to do. He prayed. Not the formal prayers from church, not the memorized verses from Sunday school. Desperate, broken pleas, torn from somewhere deeper than words usually came from. "Lord, I can't do this alone. Please, just one more? Help me get one more." And somehow he found the strength to keep moving. His mother had taught him those prayers, back in Lynchburg, Virginia, in a house that always smelled of fresh bread and old Bibles. She'd taught him that faith wasn't about feeling strong, it was about trusting God when you had nothing left. His father had taught him something else, in a moment Doss tried not to remember too often. Taught him what violence looked like up close, what a man's rage could do to the people he was supposed to love. That's when Doss had known, deep in his bones, that he could never take a life, not even to save his own. The rope was still there when he reached the cliff edge, hanging over like a promise made in better times. Doss wrestled Howell onto the stretcher with the last of his energy, secured him with trembling fingers, checked the knots twice. The rope was fraying worse now. He could see it clearly even in the fading light, individual strands splitting and curling away from the main line like hair going grey. It might not hold. It might snap halfway down and send Howell plummeting to his death on the rocks below. But staying on the ridge meant certain death. At least the rope offered a chance. He started lowering, every foot of descent an exercise in faith and physics. The stretcher swayed and bumped against the cliff face. Howell groaned with each impact. The rope creaked. Fibers popped. Doss braced himself against the shattered tree stump. Boots dug into the mud, backs straining, whispering prayers between gritted teeth that had started to chatter with cold and exhaustion. 20 feet down, 30 feet. The rope shifted in his hands, slipping an inch before he caught it, his heart stopping in his chest. Almost there, almost safe. When hands reached up from below to guide the stretcher to solid ground, Doss nearly collapsed from relief. For a moment he let himself imagine following the rope down, finding a dry spot, sleeping for a week. But he didn't descend. He couldn't, because he could still hear voices up there, faint and desperate. Please, someone. He hauled the rope back up, movements mechanical now, driven by something beyond physical capability. Below, he could see medics gathering around Howell, their faces upturned, watching him. Even from 40 feet up, he could read their expressions. Disbelief, horror, awe. They thought he was crazy. Maybe he was. Captain Glover was waiting at the top of the escarpment when Doss emerged for the 8th time, supporting Private First Class Gaines, who'd taken a bullet through the shoulder. The captain's face was a mixture of disbelief and something approaching awe in the flickering light of distant explosions. Doss, what the hell are you doing? We evacuated hours ago. The ridge is crawling with Japanese. There's still men up here, sir. Doss's voice was barely recognizable, ground down to gravel by exhaustion and smoke. I can't leave them. You're going to get yourself killed. Maybe. But I made a promise to these men. I'm their medic. He helped Gaines onto the stretcher, tied the knots with hands that could barely feel the rope anymore. The captain watched him work, something shifting behind his eyes. Glover had been career Army, 20 years in uniform, seen action in North Africa and Italy. He'd probably lowered plenty of men into graves, but he'd never seen this. Just one more, sir, Doss's voice cracked. Please. Help me get one more down. The captain didn't argue again. He just helped steady the stretcher as Doss began the descent. And so it continued through the encroaching darkness. Doss moving through the smoke and shellfire like a ghost, finding wounded men in foxholes and behind blown-apart bunkers, dragging them to the cliff edge, lowering them down on a rope that should have broken a dozen times over. Private Jackson with both hands mangled by a grenade. Corporal Trent with a shattered femur that had turned his right leg into something that bent wrong. Lieutenant Phillips, unconscious from blood loss, barely breathing. His pulse so faint, Doss had to check 3 times to be sure he was still alive. Each one a miracle. Each one impossible. Each one another soul carried from hell by a man who wouldn't carry a gun. The rope finally broke on the 14th evacuation, snapping with a crack like a gunshot when the stretcher was only 10 feet from the bottom. Private Rodriguez hit the ground hard, but survived, cushioned by the medics waiting below who'd started gathering to witness what was happening. Word was spreading through the rear positions. The medic who won't quit. The man on the rope. Someone produced a fresh rope, stronger, thicker, brought up from the battalion supply. Doss didn't ask where it came from or who'd authorized it. He just tied it off and kept working. When the Japanese launched their night counterattack in force, Doss was lowering his 17th man. Bullets snapped past his head close enough to feel the air split. Grenades exploded near enough to shower him with debris that cut his face and hands with new wounds layered over old. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop, not while there were still voices crying out in the darkness, not while the rope still held. Below, at the aid station that had been set up in a hastily cleared area behind the escarpment, Dr. Schechter worked by lantern light, hands moving with practiced efficiency through wounds he'd seen too many times. Each stretcher that came down the cliff brought another impossible case. Men who should have bled out hours ago, men with injuries that should have killed them before Doss ever found them. How many has he brought down? Schechter asked without looking up from the sucking chest wound he was packing. 17, maybe 18. The orderly's voice held something between reverence and horror. We stopped counting. Schechter had been a surgeon in Philadelphia before the war. Comfortable practice, good money, respect. He'd thought he understood medicine, thought he understood what the human body could endure. This was teaching him differently. It wasn't just the wounds. It was the fact that these men were alive at all, that someone had found them in the smoke and darkness and enemy fire, had dragged them across open ground, had lowered them down a cliff on a rope that kept fraying and somehow kept holding. "He's going to get himself killed," Schechter said. "Yes, sir. Probably." The orderly's hands never stopped moving, checking pulses, adjusting bandages. "But he's saving a lot of men first." Up on the ridge, Doss had stopped hearing the individual cries for help. They'd blended into a single continuous sound, like wind through broken trees, a chorus of pain that seemed to come from the ground itself. The mud beneath his boots was churned to soup, impossible to navigate in the dark except by feel and memory. He'd covered every yard of this plateau at least 3 times now. He knew where the shell craters were deep enough to hide in, knew which paths were exposed to enemy fire, knew where the bodies lay too still to bother checking. He found Private Dawson in a foxhole 20 yards from where B Company's line had collapsed. Dawson was 19, from Ohio, had shown Doss pictures of his girl back home just that morning. Now half his face was gone, shrapnel wound across the jaw and throat. He was trying to speak, but only bubbling sounds came out. Doss packed the wound with his second-to-last bandage, whispered reassurances he wasn't sure the boy could hear. "You're going home, Private. You're going to see that girl again. Stay with me." Dragging him to the cliff took 15 minutes that felt like hours. Machine gun fire had intensified, Japanese infantry moving through the dark in organized sweeps. Doss could hear their commands, sharp and efficient. They were thorough. They weren't leaving wounded Americans alive if they could help it. He had to move faster. The rope felt different now. The new one was thicker, yes, but his hands had lost most of their feeling. He tied the knots by muscle memory, fingers that couldn't grip properly, somehow still remembering the motions. When he lowered Dawson over the edge, he couldn't tell if the rope was slipping or if his hands just couldn't hold anymore. It held. Below, he could see more medics now, more stretcher bearers, more hands reaching up to receive the wounded. Someone had brought lanterns despite the risk of drawing enemy fire. They wanted to see him. Wanted to witness this thing that shouldn't be possible. Captain Glover was still there, had been there for hours, coordinating the evacuation, sending runners for more supplies, more stretchers, more hands. He'd stopped ordering Doss to come down. Now he just helped. Held the rope when Doss's strength flagged, checked knots, whispered his own prayers. "How many more?" Glover asked when Doss hauled the rope up for the 19th time. "Don't know, sir." Doss's voice was almost gone, reduced to a rasping whisper. "As many as I can find. The Japanese are sweeping the plateau. They'll find you eventually." "I know." Doss started back toward the plateau, moving like a man underwater, each step requiring conscious thought and effort. "Just one more, sir, just one more." He found 2 more in the next hour, found them and lost them, and found them again in the smoke and confusion. A corporal from C Company with both legs shattered. A lieutenant he didn't recognize, unconscious, barely breathing. Each trip to the cliff edge took longer. Each lowering of the rope required more prayer. His body was shutting down, muscles refusing commands, vision narrowing to a tunnel. But the voices kept calling. Somewhere in that darkness, in that impossible space between duty and death, Doss had stopped being a man named Desmond and become something simpler, a medic, a rope, a promise being kept one wounded soldier at a time. The 20-second evacuation nearly killed him. The soldier was too heavy, the rope too frayed, Doss's strength too depleted. Halfway down, the rope slipped through his hands, burning through what was left of his palms. He caught it on instinct alone, wrapped it around his wrist, felt bones grind together. The stretcher steadied, continued down, reached safety. Doss collapsed at the cliff edge, dry heaving, nothing left in his stomach to come up. He could see his hands in the flash of artillery. They didn't look like hands anymore. They looked like something that belonged in a medical textbook, in the section on severe trauma. But he could still hear voices calling from the plateau. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The night became a fever dream of smoke and prayer, and the rough bite of hemp against ruined flesh. Doss moved through it like a ghost haunting his own life, barely conscious of his actions, operating on instinct and faith alone. He'd stopped counting evacuations, stopped counting anything except the steps between wherever he found a wounded man and the cliff edge where the rope hung waiting. Private Chen, Sergeant Morrison, a lieutenant whose name he never caught. Each one blurred into the next, a continuous stream of broken bodies and desperate prayers. The Japanese were close now, close enough that Doss could hear individual voices, could hear the clack of rifle bolts and the metallic clink of grenades being prepared. They'd find him soon. He knew that, accepted it, just wanted to get one more man down first. Around 0200 hours, he found the worst case yet. The man wasn't even wearing American insignia, had been stripped by blast or enemy action. But he was breathing, and that was enough. Doss dragged him toward the cliff through a maze of shell craters, each one a potential grave. Mortar rounds walked across the plateau, each impact closer than the last. The ground shook, the air split, the world reduced to mud and smoke and the weight of another human being he refused to leave behind. The rope was still there, still holding, still waiting. Below, the gathering at the base of the cliff had grown. Word had spread beyond the immediate medical personnel. Soldiers were coming from rear positions, abandoning warm foxholes and relative safety to witness this impossible thing. They watched in silence as another stretcher descended from the darkness above, as another impossibly wounded man reached safety, as the rope went back up. "How many?" someone whispered. 30, 40. More. Has to be more. Dr. Schechter had stopped keeping precise count of the wounded. He'd simply established a triage flow, sorting men by severity, sending the critical cases to the field hospital 2 miles back, treating the moderate cases on site, marking the hopeless ones for morphine and comfort. But each man who came down that cliff was hopeless by every standard measure. Each one should have been dead. Each one was alive because of the medic still up there in the dark. "He's been at it for 8 hours, Schechter said to no one in particular. 9, an orderly corrected. 9 hours since the retreat order. It's not possible. And yet, the orderly gestured at the rows of stretchers, at the wounded men who would see morning, who would see home. And yet, up on the plateau, Doss had entered a strange space beyond exhaustion. His body had been running on empty for hours. Now it was running on something else, something he couldn't name but recognized from church, from the stories his mother read him about men who did impossible things through faith alone. His hands barely functioned. His legs trembled with every step. His vision came and went, darkness creeping in from the edges. But he could still hear the voices. And while he could hear them, he had to keep moving. He found a cluster of 3 men in a demolished bunker, all from the same squad, all wounded in the same blast. The logical thing would be to triage, to take the one who could survive and leave the others. Doss took all 3, made 3 trips, dragging each to the cliff, lowering each down, hauling the rope back up. The Japanese were so close now, he could smell their cigarettes, could hear conversations he didn't understand. On the second trip, a grenade landed 15 feet from where he knelt, securing a soldier to the stretcher. He covered the man's body with his own, felt the blast wave pass over them, felt shrapnel punch into his pack and helmet. When he dared to look up, the rope was still there. The soldier was still breathing. That was enough. Somewhere around the 30th or 40th evacuation, he'd truly lost count. Doss's body finally refused to cooperate. He dragged a wounded man to the cliff edge, secured him to the stretcher, checked the knots. When he tried to start lowering, his hands simply wouldn't grip. The rope slipped through fingers that had no feeling left, no strength remaining. He fell to his knees, gasping, and felt something crack inside him. Not bones, though those were probably damaged too. Something deeper. The thing that had been holding him together through 9 hours of impossible effort. He knelt there at the cliff edge, hands hovering over the rope he couldn't hold, and felt the weight of every man still crying out in the darkness. "I can't," he whispered to the smoke and thunder. "God, I can't anymore." The voices answered him, crying out, begging, dying. Please, just one more. His own prayer reflected back at him. The prayer that had sustained him through dozens of evacuations. Just one more, just one more, just one more. But there was always one more. The voices never stopped. The wounded never ran out. When did it end? When was enough enough? "Lord." His voice broke on the word, tears streaming down his face, mixing with blood and mud and smoke. "I can't do this alone. Help me. Please, just help me get one more." And somehow, impossibly, his hands found strength to grip the rope, found coordination to lower the stretcher, found whatever spark of will remained buried beneath the exhaustion and pain and terror. He got that man down, hauled the rope back up, went looking for another. The voices had become his compass, his map, his entire world. He followed them through the smoke, crawled toward them through mud and fire, found the sources and dragged them toward salvation. His mind had stopped processing the injuries, stopped cataloging wounds. His hands just moved through familiar motions. Pack, lift, drag, secure, lower. Again, again, again. Dawn was approaching when he found what he thought might be the last one. A sergeant pinned beneath a collapsed gun position, both legs crushed. The man had been calling for hours, voice nearly gone, hope long since fled. When he saw Doss emerge from the smoke, his eyes went wide. "You're not real." Voice like broken glass. "You can't be real." "I'm real, Sergeant. Let's get you home." Getting the sergeant free took precious minutes Doss wasn't sure he had. The collapsed timber that pinned the man's legs was heavy, waterlogged from rain, slick with mud. Doss wedged a shattered rifle beneath it as a lever. Threw what remained of his body weight against the improvised tool, felt the timber shift. The sergeant screamed, but he came free. Dragging him to the cliff edge, Doss could feel his own body shutting down in stages. First his legs went numb, moving on automatic, each step a conscious act of will, transmitted through dying nerves. Then his arms, barely maintaining enough grip on the sergeant's uniform to pull. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel, darkness creeping in from all sides. He could hear his heartbeat, too fast, irregular, struggling, but he could still hear one other thing. The voices had stopped. The plateau had gone quiet except for enemy movement and distant artillery. He'd found them all. Every American still breathing on this God-forsaken ridge, he'd found and lowered to safety. This sergeant was the last one. Just one more. The final one more. The rope was waiting. It always was. Doss secured the sergeant with hands that could barely feel what they were touching, checked knots he couldn't properly see, started lowering with technique burned so deep into muscle memory that consciousness wasn't required. Halfway down, the Japanese found him. Not with bullets or grenades, though those would come shortly. They found him with sight. An enemy soldier emerged from the smoke 20 yards away, rifle raised, and froze. Later, survivors would report different versions of what happened. Some said the Japanese soldier simply stared for a long moment before disappearing back into smoke. Others insisted he raised his rifle, took aim, then deliberately fired wide. Still others claimed he'd shouted something to companions in the darkness, words that might have been an order to hold fire. What happened didn't matter as much as what didn't. The shot never came. The grenade wasn't thrown. Doss finished lowering the sergeant to safety, and when he looked up again, the Japanese soldier was gone. He collapsed against the tree stump that had held the rope all night, unable to move, barely able to breathe. Below, he could hear voices rising in a strange mixture of cheers and prayers. Morning light was breaking through the smoke, turning the world from black to grey to the colours of a normal day that shouldn't exist after the night they'd all survived. Captain Glover appeared beside him, seemed to materialise from the dawn. "Doss, we need to get you down." "Is that all of them?" Doss's voice was barely a whisper, ground down to nothing. "Is everyone down?" "Everyone we could find." The captain's voice was gentle, careful, like speaking to something fragile about to break. "You got them all, Doss. Time to come down now." But Doss couldn't move. His body had finally given everything it had, and there was nothing left. Not for climbing down, not for walking, not even for keeping his eyes open. He felt Glover's hands securing something around his waist, realized dimly that they were attaching him to the rope, that they were going to lower him like one of the wounded. The descent was a blur of pain and darkness, and the sensation of falling without end. When hands caught him at the bottom, when they laid him on a stretcher and started cutting away his uniform to assess injuries, he tried to speak but couldn't. Tried to ask if everyone made it but had no voice left. Dr. Schechter was there, examining hands that no longer resembled hands, eyes that had seen things no one should see. "He'll live," the doctor said, though his tone suggested surprise. "Don't know how, but he'll live." Doss wanted to tell them he knew how, wanted to explain that it wasn't him, not really, that he'd just been the hands God used tonight, the rope God pulled. But the darkness was claiming him finally, pulling him down into something that might be sleep or death or simple absence of everything that had been. His last conscious thought was the count. How many had he brought down? He'd lost track sometime after 30, knew it was more. Knew each face even if he couldn't remember all the names. When consciousness returned, hours later, maybe days, Captain Glover was sitting beside his cot in the field hospital, holding a clipboard. "How many?" Doss's voice was ruined, barely recognizable. "You asking me? I lost count." The captain looked at the clipboard, and something in his expression was harder than Doss had ever seen it. Not angry. Something else. Something that looked like a man confronting evidence of something he'd thought impossible. 75, Glover said quietly. 75 men, Doss. We counted 3 times, matched names to faces. 75 soldiers who should have died on that ridge. The number didn't feel real, felt like it belonged to someone else's story, someone else's impossible night. Doss stared at his bandaged hands, at the IV running into his arm, at the walls of the medical tent that seemed too solid, too ordinary for what he remembered. "I was so scared," he whispered. "The whole time. I thought I was going to die up there." "We all did." "And I wanted to stop, wanted to come down. Every single time I hauled that rope back up, I wanted it to be the last time." Glover was quiet for a moment, studying him with eyes that had seen 20 years of war. "But you didn't stop." "No." "Why not?" Doss thought about that, about the voices that kept calling, about the prayer that had sustained him, about the promise he'd made when he became a medic, and the faith his mother had taught him in that house in Lynchburg that smelled of bread and old Bibles. "Because I could still hear them, and while I could hear them," he trailed off. Glover nodded like he understood. "They're going to write this up, you know. Medal recommendation. The works. They'll want you to tell the story. How you did it." Doss closed his eyes, exhausted beyond measure. "I just held the rope," he said. The official citation would eventually use words like outstanding bravery and unflinching determination. It would describe tactical decisions and medical skill, would analyze his actions through the lens of military valor and strategic importance. Fellow soldiers would tell the story for years afterward, each version growing slightly larger, slightly more impossible, until Desmond Doss became less a man and more a legend. But lying in that field hospital with hands that would take months to heal and memories that would take a lifetime to process, Doss knew something the citation would never capture. He knew what the voices sounded like, each one distinct, each one desperate. He knew the weight of 75 bodies dragged across mud and rock. He knew the exact texture of the rope as it frayed, the specific moment when each strand gave way. He knew the sound his own voice made when it broke on the word, please. He knew what fear tasted like at the back of his throat, metallic and sharp, present through every second of those 9 hours. The legend wouldn't include that. Legends rarely did. 2 weeks after Hacksaw Ridge, Doss received a letter from Private Hernandez's mother. She'd written it in careful English, each word chosen with the weight of something that mattered more than grammar. "My son tells me you dug him out with your bare hands," she wrote. "That you dragged him through enemy fire, that you lowered him down a cliff on a rope. He tells me you saved his life. I do not know how to thank you for this. I do not know if thanks are enough. But I thank you anyway, and I pray for you every night, and I hope you know that because of you, my son will come home." The letter sat on Doss's chest for a long time after he finished reading it. 75 letters like this existed somewhere, or would soon. 75 mothers who would get their sons back. 75 faces he would remember for the rest of his life. Sergeant Howell came to see him before shipping out to a stateside hospital. The man who'd called him a coward in basic training, who'd questioned his courage, his faith, his worth as a soldier. He stood beside Doss's cot, big hands twisted together, struggling with words. "I was wrong about you," he finally said. "Everything I said, everything I thought, I was wrong." "You weren't wrong to be scared," Doss replied. "We were all scared. But you went back up anyway. So would you have, if you'd heard them calling." Howell shook his head slowly. "I don't know. I'd like to think so, but I don't know." They sat in silence for a moment, two men who'd been enemies and were now something else, something without a good name. "What you did up there," Howell said, "that wasn't human. That was something else." "It was just faith," Doss said quietly, "and a rope that held." After Howell left, Dr. Schechter came to change Doss's bandages. The doctor worked with practiced efficiency, unwrapping layers of gauze, examining the slow healing of tissue that had been ground to hamburger. "You'll have scars," Schechter said, "on your hands, your arms, permanent damage to the nerves. I know. You'll remember this for the rest of your life. I know that too." Schechter finished the bandaging, gathered his supplies, hesitated. "I was a surgeon in Philadelphia before the war. Thought I understood medicine, understood healing. Then I watched you bring 75 men down that cliff, and I realized I don't understand anything. How does a man do that? How does a human body physically accomplish what you did?" Doss thought about the question, about all the moments when his body had quit and something else had carried him forward. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I remember praying. I remember the rope. I remember thinking just one more, over and over until the words stopped meaning anything. But how I actually did it," he shook his head. "I just held the rope, Doc, that's all I know. The Medal of Honor would come later, presented by President Truman in a ceremony Doss would barely remember, too overwhelmed by the attention, by the weight of all those eyes watching him, by the knowledge that 74 other men had done equally impossible things that night, and no one would ever know their names. The nightmares would come too, dreams of voices he couldn't reach, of ropes that broke, of the one more man he couldn't save. He'd wake gasping, hands moving through familiar motions, tying knots in blankets, securing stretchers that weren't there. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, he'd hear the prayer that had sustained him through the longest night of his life. "Just one more. Please, Lord, help me get one more." Years later, when people asked him about Hacksaw Ridge, about the impossible night when he saved 75 men, Doss would tell them the truth as he understood it. Not about bravery or heroism or any of the words the citation used. He'd tell them about fear that tasted like copper, about hands that stopped working and somehow kept working anyway, about a fraying rope that should have broken and didn't. He'd tell them that the hardest part wasn't the physical effort or the enemy fire or the 9 hours of impossible work, The hardest part was living with the memory of it afterward, carrying the weight of those 75 faces, knowing that his nightmares were the price they'd paid to go home to their families. The rope, burned and frayed and stained with blood, had been cut down and forgotten within days. But what it represented, a lifeline lowering wounded men from hell, held steady by shaking hands and unshakable faith, would endure far longer than any weapon fired that day. And sometimes, when the nightmares got bad, Doss would close his eyes and feel phantom hemp against his palms, feel the weight of another wounded man on a stretcher descending into darkness, and know with absolute certainty that he'd do it all again. Every impossible second, every prayer, every ounce of pain. Because that's what the rope meant to him. Not heroism, not bravery, just the simple, terrible knowledge that while men were calling for help, while his hands could still grip and his legs could still move, he had no choice but to answer. Captain Glover understood that, in the end. Understood why Doss couldn't take credit for what he'd done, couldn't accept that it was anything more than being in the right place with the right faith and a rope that held. "How did you do it?" people would ask for the rest of Doss's life, and he'd give them the only answer he had, the only truth he knew. "I didn't do it. I just held the rope." If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.